Bonjour tout le monde. Good afternoon. I'm joined today by Ministers Blair, LeBlanc and Anand, as well as ministers from regions affected by the storm. Hurricane Fiona is currently having a terrible impact across Atlantic Canada and eastern Quebec. We're seeing devastating images come out of Port aux Basques. PEI has experienced storm damage like they've never seen. Cape Breton is being hit hard too, as is Quebec. There have been evacuation orders issued. Hundreds of thousands of people are without power. There are reports of roads washed out and homes destroyed. We've all seen the images. This is a very powerful and dangerous storm. We're thinking first and foremost of the people who've had a terrifying past 12 hours. People have seen their homes washed away, seen the winds rip schools, roofs off. But as Canadians, as we always do in times of difficulty, we will be there for each other. Les Canadiens pensent à tous ceux qui sont touchés par l'ouragan Fiona, qui a des effets dévastateurs dans les provinces de l'Atlantique et dans l'Est du Québec, particulièrement aux îles de la Madeleine. Il y a des gens qui voient leur maison détruite, des gens qui sont très inquiets. On va être là pour vous. On continue de suivre la situation de très près et bien sûr, le gouvernement fédéral est là pour offrir du soutien aux provinces avec des ressources additionnelles. I will, of course, no longer be attending the state funeral in Japan, and our government is fully engaged in supporting Canadians through this major storm. I've spoken with Premiers Fury, King, Higgs, Houston, and Legault. I've told them that if there is anything the federal government can do to help, we will be there. Earlier today, I convened the Incident Response Group, and our government is standing ready to support provinces with any necessary resources. We've approved Nova Scotia's request for federal assistance and will deploy the Canadian Armed Forces to assist in assessment and cleanup and stand ready to do more. We're seeing reports of significant damage in the region, and recovery is going to be a big effort. We will be there to support every step of the way. I know Canadians across the country, as always, want to help. So we're announcing that we will match any Red Cross donations Canadians and corporations make over the next 30 days. Je sais que les Canadiens à travers le pays veulent aider. Alors c'est pourquoi on va égaler les dons offerts à la Croix-Rouge canadienne pour l'ouragan Fiona pendant les 30 prochains jours. However, today and tomorrow, the situation remains very dangerous. Please stay safe, listen carefully to local authorities, and look out for each other. On voit déjà beaucoup de dommages et la situation reste critique. Aujourd'hui et demain, j'encourage tout le monde à continuer d'écouter les autorités locales et de faire tout ce qu'il faut pour rester en sécurité. Je vais maintenant passer la parole au ministre Blair.
Bill? Thank you very much, Prime Minister, and bon après-midi tout le monde. Let me begin by joining the Prime Minister in expressing that our thoughts are with Canadians in Atlantic Canada and Quebec as they struggle through the impacts of Hurricane Fiona. At approximately 3:48 a.m. this morning, post-tropical storm Fiona made landfall between Canso and Guysborough, Nova Scotia. And as the storm tracked northward, with its high winds, its very heavy rainfall and storm surges, it has had a devastating impact across the Maritimes, Quebec, and Newfoundland, Labrador. The storm is not yet passed. It remains a dangerous storm. But as it's expected to track northwards today, it will lose strength and remain a post-tropical cyclone in the northeast corner of the Gulf of St. Lawrence by Sunday morning. And as we move from response to the storm into a period of recovery, I want to assure all Canadians and the Prime Minister that my colleagues and all of our officials right across the federal government, in every department and in every ministry, have been fully engaged in the response and will be there throughout the recovery. I've been in touch with my provincial counterparts, and our government's message is clear. Whatever you need, we will be there with you, We will be there for you, and we will deliver. I've also spoken with our Atlantic MPs and members of the opposition because we know that in an emergency, we are all on one team, and we all must work together in the best interest of keeping Canadians safe. We are seeing severe damages to homes, critical public infrastructure, roads, and our airports. A significant number of trees are down right across the region. And we know the impacts of the power grid are still being assessed, but are in fact very extensive. We have heard from all of the provinces, and as they assess the damage, we anticipate that there will be several requests for federal assistance. We have been preparing and working with them and positioning our resources to mobilize over the past number of days as we followed Fiona's course so that we could move quickly when the requests came in. And as the Prime Minister earlier mentioned, today I and Minister Anand approved for federal assistance from the Government of Canada to the province of Nova Scotia. Canadian Armed Forces personnel will be deployed to assist with the debris removal and to restore transportation links. And Canadian Armed Forces aerial assets will be used to get a better sense of the damage. And if the costs of the recovery are too much for any province to bear, we have a program through the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement to provide federal funding to make it available to reimburse them for the costs that they may incur for the recovery. There are still many unknowns in this storm, and the recovery will take time. Right now, I would urge all Canadians to follow the advice that they're receiving from their local authorities. The most important imperative is to stay safe. And when the storm has passed, and it's safe to do so in your community, I'd like you to take the opportunity to check on your family, your neighbors, your friends, and your loved ones, in particular to those who may be living in vulnerable circumstances. Together, we will all get through this. And it is only by standing together and working together that we can respond and rebuild in a way that will restore the confidence of those who have been impacted by this terrible storm. God bless and Godspeed. And with that, I would like to turn it over to my colleague, Minister LeBlanc.
Good afternoon. Bonjour. Thank you, Minister Blair. Thank you, Prime Minister. Comme a dit le ministre Blair, il y a encore
Minister Blair said, there are still many unknowns. Today, I spoke with the 4 premiers of the Atlantic provinces and my Quebec counterparts in order to express our support. And I will remain in contact with them over the next hours and the next days. We will be there to help the communities that have been hit in order to get through this disaster.
Will be difficult for many Atlantic Canadians and Quebecers, and we're here to assure them that the Government of Canada will be there with them every step of the way as the recovery effort begins. And I will remain in close contact with premiers over the coming hours and days. And I'll now pass the microphone to my colleague, the Minister of National Defence, Anita Anand.
Merci beaucoup, Dom et Bill.
Thank you very much,
thank
Dom,
you, Prime Minister.
Bill.
Good afternoon. I'm joining you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, and today we reaffirm our commitment to meaningful reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. Over the past several hours, we have seen images of devastating impacts of Hurricane Fiona in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec. Fiona has wreaked havoc on homes and communities, blocking roads and tearing down infrastructure. And as a Nova Scotian myself, my thoughts are with you all. To everyone in Atlantic Canada and Eastern Quebec, we are activating the necessary resources to help you. We will continue to stand with you. And I want to emphasize that even before we received a request for assistance, the Canadian Armed Forces had been preparing and mobilizing in case they were called upon to help. For example, the Canadian Armed Forces embedded liaison officers within provincial emergency management organizations in all 4 Atlantic provinces, first, to share information, and second, to ensure that there was a development of a common understanding of the situation. Et comme mes collègues l'ont souligné,
and as my colleagues have pointed out, the federal government has now received a request for assistance from Nova Scotia in order to clean up tree debris, to do air reconnaissance and related tasks.
Furthermore, all 3 branches of the Canadian Armed Forces are preparing equipment and personnel. The Royal Canadian Navy ships HMCS Margaret Brooke and HMCS Goose Bay are in St. John's and ready to respond if necessary. In Halifax, the ready-duty ship remains available. The Navy is also preparing small boats to respond to inland flooding and one tug to support harbor operations if required. The Royal Canadian Air Force has CC-130 Hercules aircraft, CH-146 Griffin, CH-147 Chinook, and CH-148 Cyclones ready to respond. As always, search and rescue units are on standby and can be called upon to conduct operations at a moment's notice. The Canadian Army's Immediate Response Unit in Gagetown, New Brunswick, has increased its readiness to move at short notice and deploy if called upon. The Canadian Armed Forces are now commencing reconnaissance and preparing for preliminary moves to better understand where and what is required. And these Canadian Armed Forces members will come from the Immediate Response Unit in Gagetown with the possibility of additional members joining from local reserves and CFB Halifax. À mesure que la situation évolue,
as the situation develops, we remain ready to respond in Nova Scotia and in other provinces which may need our assistance. We will work closely with provinces and other partners, and I pledge to all Canadians that we will do everything in our power to help you.
And as the situation evolves, we remain ready to respond in Nova Scotia and in other provinces that may need our help. We will continue to collaborate closely with provinces and other partners, and I promise all Canadians that we will always do whatever we can to help you. Nous remercions les membres des forces armées
canadiennes. We would like to thank the members of the Canadian Armed Forces and all those who are participating in these efforts for their diligent work and their dedication to their fellow citizens.
This is an all-hands-on-deck effort, and I know that our Canadian Armed Forces will rise to the challenge, as they always do. Thank you. Merci. Miigwech.
We will now take questions.
No, I believe we're passing it over to Minister O'Regan.
Minister O'Regan, you can proceed with your remarks.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'll be brief. Here in St. John's, we have been spared much of Fiona's fury, but people here, the city's frozen. Everybody is watching TV. Everybody knows people in Port aux Basques. This is a community that's very familiar to people here, and the devastation that most of the country is seeing, we see here, and we take it to heart. I spoke with Mayor Brian Button earlier, as I know my colleague Minister Hutchings has, and he said there's a devastation there that they just haven't seen and couldn't even imagine. People there are used to having power outages, but it is quite another thing to lose your home. And he told me that there are at least 20 homes now that are lost. We are dealing closely with the provincial government. I've been speaking with the Premier, with the Justice and Public Safety Minister, as well as the Minister of Natural Resources, who's the member for that area. And they are all working on the ground, with people on the ground. What can I say other than we are working together the way that Canadians expect us to, the way that Newfoundlanders and Labradorians expect us to. I was down and visited HMCS Margaret Brooke, one of the Navy's newest vessels that's in the harbour today. You have a fine crew there and a brand new ship that I know would be ready and willing to help, as Minister Anand had suggested. We have seen each other through crises here in this province before, as we have in other parts of the country. And here I think of Hurricane Igor and of the great snowstorm back in 2020. We work together, hand in glove, all levels of government, to get things done for people who are in need right now, who are desperately in need. Thank you.
Thank you. Passing it now to Minister Hutchins.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Colleagues, as Minister Regan said, Eastern Canada communities, we're no stranger to the sea, and we know the force it can bring. But when I spoke to the local mayors yesterday to make sure they were prepared as they were, they said, we have another concern, that it's a full moon, and on a full moon you have higher tides. And they said that's going to make this just devastating, and they were correct. So our thoughts and prayers, as all my colleagues have said, go out to everyone impacted by this all throughout Eastern Canada. But remember, friends, as this travels along the coast of the island of Newfoundland and into Newfoundland and Labrador, please, please, please listen to the authorities. I really want to thank the first responders for their fast action today and thank them for the hard work they're going to have in the coming days and weeks. As Seamus said, Newfoundlanders and Labradorians always pull together, and by working together with all levels of government, we will support our communities and our residents as needed now and as we build back. I'll be in Port aux Basques tomorrow. Looking forward to seeing Mayor Button, Brian, myself. In the meantime, stay safe, everyone, and Godspeed.
Et maintenant, la ministre Leboutillier,
Minister
ministre et
Leboutillier,
député des îles et
the member for
Gaspésie.
Gaspésie and Magdalen Islands. Please go ahead.
Merci, Monsieur le Premier
Thank
ministre.
you,
Et
Prime
vraiment, je tiens à
Minister.
vous remercier là, d'être
And I
avec
would
nous et
like
nos
to
populations là,
thank
pendant les
you
périodes
for
difficiles.
supporting
Je tiens à
our
souligner aussi la
residents
force et la
during this
résilience
time.
des
Our
Madelinos et des
forte
Madeliennes
is
qui sont
resilience.
des experts, je dois vous
Those
dire,
in
là,
the
dans la
Magdalen
gestion
Islands
des
are
tempêtes, qui ont
experts
vécu
in
aussi Dorian
managing storms.
il y a 3 ans,
They went through
passés.
Dorian
Puis
3
je veux
years
aussi
ago.
prendre le temps de souligner tout le
And
travail
I
qui
would
est fait
also like to
par
point
les
out all
maires,
the
les
work that
préfets,
is
puis à tous
done
ceux qui ont
by
travaillé pour
the
garder les
mayors and all those
populations
who
en
have worked
sécurité
to keep the
pendant
residents safe
la tempête Fiona.
during Hurricane
Je peux vous
Fiona.
dire que depuis
I can tell
mercredi,
you that
j'étais en
since
contact
Wednesday,
avec
I've been
les
in
gens du
contact
milieu, les gens
with
des
people in
îles,
the
puis avec mes
communities,
collègues
people on
aussi,
the
le
islands,
ministre
with
Blair,
my
le
colleagues
ministre
as well,
Anand,
Minister Blair,
le
Minister
ministre
Anand,
Algabra, le ministre
Minister
Guilbeault.
Algabra,
Je
Minister
remercie tous mes
Guilbeault,
collègues,
and
tout
I'd
le
like to
monde a mis
thank all of
l'épaule à
my
la roue.
colleagues.
Puis
Everyone
pour
has
moi,
really
c'est
stepped up,
ce qui
and
nous a apporté,
for
amené
me,
la force de
that
pouvoir
is what
passer
makes
là,
the
à
strength
travers
of
cette
this
tempête.
government and of all
Actuellement,
Canadians.
la tempête
Currently,
remonte vers le nord,
Hurricane Fiona
donc
is
on
moving
est dans le
north,
secteur de Sainte-Anne-des-Monts, puis
and
se
that
rend
is in the
vers la
Sainte-Anne-des-Monts
Mais suite
area.
à son
It's heading to the
passage, il
North
va falloir
Shore,
prendre
and
connaissance des
after
dommages,
that,
il
we're
va
going to
falloir
have to
travailler
assess the damage,
ensemble.
and we're
Puis
going
comme
to have to
souvent
work
dit, des
together.
gens d'expérience
And
qui ont
as
passé avant nous, ce qui ne
people who have
nous tue
experience
pas
with
nous
this
rend
have
plus
said,
forts. Puis en
what doesn't
Gaspésie
kill
et
us
aux
makes
îles,
us
on
strong
est
in the
habitués
Gaspésie and
d'avoir
in
des
the
tempêtes.
Magdalen Islands.
Donc, on
We're
va
very
mettre
used to
tout le monde
having
l'épaule à la roue, on
storms,
va
so
serrer les
everyone is
coudes,
going to
puis
stand
on va
together. We're going
travailler
to
là, pour
work together
construire pour
to
l'avenir. Merci.
rebuild for the future. Thank you very much.
Merci au Premier ministre, au ministre. Maintenant, nous allons passer à la
Prime
période
Minister,
de
Ministers,
questions,
now
en
we're going
commençant
to
par les
question
questions
period,
dans la
beginning
salle.
with the
Rappelle que nous
questions
avons
in
20
the
minutes
room.
avec le
We
Premier
have
ministre
20
et ensuite
minutes
10
with the
minutes
Prime
avec
Minister
les
and then 10
ministres.
minutes with the
Tous ceux qui sont
ministers.
sur Zoom, si vous
All
avez une
those who
question,
are on
veuillez
Zoom,
utiliser
if you
la
have
fonction
any
main
questions,
levée, s'il vous
please
plaît. So
use the
we'll
raise
now
hand
go to
function.
questions, starting with questions in the room, then on Zoom. A reminder to use the raised hand function if you do have questions on Zoom, and a reminder that we have 20 minutes with the Prime Minister and then 10 minutes with the ministers. So we will start with Christian Pauslang from CBC.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Mr. Prime Minister. Can you just clarify a bit when Canadians in Nova Scotia can expect the help that has been promised from the military? I've heard the details, but would like some more.
I can tell you that the work has already begun over the past number of days, knowing how serious Fiona could potentially be. We already put things in place, but I can turn to Minister Blair and Minister Anand for further detail on when things start to arrive on the ground.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'll go first, if I may. As you indicated, we began mobilizing our resources. Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Coast Guard, Transport Canada have all been embedded in the provincial emergency operations centers and engaging with our provincial and local counterparts to make sure that we were prepared to respond and to work together. There's been conversations throughout the morning with provincial ministers and officials, and coordination with Canadian Armed Forces and the Canadian Coast Guard in particular. And those resources are already mobilized and will be in place at the earliest opportunity. I believe that Nova Scotians will begin to see the presence of the Canadian Armed Forces very, very quickly, because we'll be working closely with Nova Scotia officials in debris removal and providing the supports and services that they ask for. And Anita, if you've got any further information on that, please share.
Thank you so much, Bill. Yes, we have been preparing even before we received a request for assistance. The Canadian Armed Forces have been preparing and mobilizing in case they're called upon to help. And so at this moment, the reconnaissance, or recce, is occurring to ensure that we deploy where and when as needed. And the situation is evolving, but the resources and the equipment are on the ground. And as soon as this recce is completed, the troops will be deployed to assist. with the tree and debris removal and the restoring of transportation links and whatever else is required for as long as it takes. Thanks.
I wonder, Mr. Prime Minister, since you won't be attending a state funeral in Japan, if you or any of your ministers who are not currently already in the region are planning to visit the damaged areas.
I will be going to the damaged areas as soon as it is possible for me to do so. The last thing I want to do is displace any of the extraordinary emergency teams and authorities who are rightly focusing on everything needed on the ground. But I will be out there to see people and to demonstrate that all Canadians stand with them as quickly as is responsible.
Christian Noël, Radio-Canada.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier ministre. Bonjour, Madame Leboutillier et les autres ministres aussi. Vous avez discuté avec les autres premiers ministres des provinces de tous ces dégâts-là, de ce qui s'est passé, de ce qui se passe avec les gens aussi qui vivent en Atlantique. De ces conversations, qu'est-ce qui ressort? Qu'est-ce que vous a marqué? Et quel est votre message aux gens?
Tout d'abord, je souligne à quel point tous les premiers ministres et tous les gens à travers ces provinces-là étaient conscients que ça s'en venait, que ça allait peut-être être
premiers and so forth knew that this storm was coming, and they knew that it could potentially be devastating, so people got ready.
La réponse a été extrêmement rapide et les gens avaient vécu des tempêtes pas tout à fait comme ça, mais des tempêtes graves au préalable.
Perhaps not to this extent, but they have experienced these storms before, so there was a very high level of readiness already. At the same time, what we see is that people are there to help each other, to help their neighbors, their friends. The first responders are there on the front lines doing extraordinary work.
Vraiment, il y a eu une mobilisation et une entraide. Tous les premiers ministres
extensive mobilization. All the premiers know that the federal government is there for them.
Assez importantes
but they also have considerable resources with which to respond to the needs on the ground. So it's great teamwork, and we're there to help each other because that's what we do as Canadians. That's our specialty. I know that these are very difficult times right now. People who have seen their homes swept away, who've seen their property destroyed, but I also know that people know that they're not alone, and we're going to continue to be there for them. Question: we're perhaps talking about billions of dollars, especially with regard to restoration of transport links and infrastructure. What is the priority? What is the concrete assistance that you can send right now to help the people, the residents, and what kind of amounts are we talking about in terms of funding? First of all, we're there to help with the resources necessary, whether it be the Canadian Armed Forces, specialized units. We're adding to the teams that provinces already have to respond. I've already had conversations with the provincial premiers because they have said that there are people who have insurance that may not cover this type of event, but we are going to be there to help those people. We know that this is a horrific event. It has hit people very hard, and we're not going to turn our backs on them. The federal government is going to be there with the funding required. We don't have to worry about that right now. Right now is the time to weather the next 24 hours and to be there for each other. And in the weeks and months and perhaps in the years to come, we're going to continue to be there for everyone. Question: what did you think of? What went through your head when you saw these devastating images? Well, I remember the flooding in the Saguenay, and we saw houses swept away, and the images that we saw in Powell Basque or Chandler, where we saw houses simply falling into the water and being swept away. So I hope that people, that there are not too many injuries or casualties. We have to be there for people to make sure that their homes can be rebuilt, and we're going to be there for them. But until then, people have to remain safe and healthy. Thank you. Could you repeat that in English, please?
Obviously, as we see the images of houses falling into the sea, of waves destroying property and buildings, our first thought needs to be for people, to make sure that people are staying safe. Buildings and even communities can be rebuilt, but we have to make sure that we're keeping everyone safe. So as Minister Blair pointed out, as you're making sure that yourself and your loved ones are safe, think about in the coming hours and days, as it is safe, reaching out to people who may be vulnerable or alone. Canadians stand up for each other. We're there for each other. It's one of the incredible things about this country. And in times of distress and terror like this, where people are afraid for their lives, for their future, we need to be there for each other, and that's exactly what Canadians are going to be.
Okay, we'll go to questions on Zoom. A reminder to use the raise hand function if you do have a question. N'oubliez pas d'utiliser la fonction main levée pour me signifier que vous avez une question. Seeing there are no questions on Zoom, is there a question in person?
Certainement.
Yes, please.
Quand on parle des forces armées canadiennes,
Question. When we talk about the Canadian Armed Forces,
de quelle base, de quelle région, ils ont arrivé quand, quel genre de
base, from
matériel,
which region,
quel genre d'aide ils
what
vont
type
offrir aux
of
citoyens.
equipment, and what type of assistance will they bring to citizens? First of all, as the ministers have said, there's already personnel that has been mobilized even before the hurricane hit, because we knew that damage would be caused and that assistance would be required. So there are a great many units on the ground right now, and in the hours and days to come, there are going to be more and more, but I'm going to allow Minister Anand to add more details. Thank you.
Oui, merci pour
Thank you very much
la question.
for the question.
Aussi, les forces armées canadiennes commencent maintenant à effectuer des reconnaissances, comme j'ai dit, et à préparer des déplacements préliminaires afin de mieux comprendre où et quoi est nécessaire. Ces membres des forces armées canadiennes vont être là pour les provinces et ils vont venir de Gagetown avec la possibilité que d'autres membres se joignent à partir des réserves locales et de la BFC Halifax. Mais maintenant, c'est le temps pour trouver, pour chercher l'information importante et après ça, de s'assurer que nous avons le personnel là pour les provinces dont ils ont besoin.
And give them the assistance they need. Thank you. CBC.
Yeah, your government has spent money on resilient infrastructure. Do events like this indicate you need to be even more aggressive?
Well, obviously, we're getting more severe storms more frequently. Whether it was wildfires this past summer, whether it was the terrible flooding in BC just last year. We know there is a need for more resilient infrastructure. There is a need to draw on the lessons that we learned on how to rebuild infrastructure quickly following the BC floods. We know there's lots to do, and of course that is something that this government takes seriously. Building infrastructure that is going to be able to withstand extreme weather events, maybe a one in 100-year storm that tend to start hitting every few years instead of every centuries. We're going to need to continue to be aware of how to invest, how to make our communities more resilient, but also think about how we continue to do our part to fight climate change, because things are only getting worse.
Juste en français là-dessus, s'il vous plaît.
Évidemment, en tant que gouvernement, nous avons eu à répondre.
As a government, we have had to respond to more and more extreme weather events over the past years, whether it be heat waves, flooding, or forest fires. or this type of hurricane. So we're going to be there to rebuild and invest in more and more resilient infrastructure because we're going to need it. At the same time, it shows how important it is to continue our fight against climate change because we're dealing with the 1 in 100-year storms, which seem to be happening more and more frequently. Thank you.
Et dernière question de suivi va
Last
aller à
question,
Annie
follow-up.
sur Zoom. Si vous pouviez juste vous identifier, s'il vous
With
plaît. Merci.
Annie on Zoom. Please identify yourself.
Hi there. Thank you for taking our questions. It's Annie Bergeron-Oliver at CTV National News. I'm wondering if you can provide any numbers on how many troops will be deployed to Nova Scotia.
I'm happy to turn it over to Minister Anand for that, but we will respond to whatever requests are made. We have the necessary numbers to be able to respond to whatever is asked for. In regards to Nova Scotia, I'll turn it over to Minister Anand.
Okay, thank you so much, Prime Minister and Annie. We have been planning and making sure that we are ready. And so we have Gagetown as well as other possibilities from reserves and CFB Halifax ready to respond. But as I said, the first priority is for us to complete the reconnaissance, to ensure that we are deploying the right number of troops to the locales that are needed. And we are embedded with the provincial organizations, including with Nova Scotia, to ensure that we are making the best use of the assets that are ready to be deployed, including in the human resource area. So the situation is evolving on a minute-by-minute basis, and we will have more information to share as soon as that recce is done and the troops themselves have been deployed. As I said, they're coming from Gagetown primarily, as well as CFB Halifax and other reserves. And I'll have precise numbers for you in the short term. Thank you.
And Annie, it's Bill Blair, and if I just also might jump in, the Canadian Coast Guard is also, in addition to the excellent response of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Coast Guard is also present. There are presence already in Port aux Basques, in the Magdalene Islands. This is, in many aspects, a maritime event, and the Canadian Coast Guard is deployed. They have ships, they have helicopters, and they've got personnel. And they're already in the community, and they're already responding. 2 days ago, they stood up their incident management teams, and they've been working very closely with local authorities in order to respond. And I'd even point out that the Coast Guard training facility located in Sydney, Nova Scotia, that community was significantly impacted by the impact of Fiona passing through there. Shelters have been damaged, and the Coast Guard's opened up the doors of their training facility to take people in. And so that response is immediate, it's there, it's in place, and we'll get you numbers on that as soon as they're available.
Thank you very much. And my follow-up is sort of along the same lines. I'm wondering if you can provide some type of insight about what the premiers were asking for in terms of overall assistance from the federal government this morning. So far as I'm aware, only Nova Scotia has officially asked for the military. So what other type of assistance has been requested and can be provided to those provinces who have yet to ask for the military's help?
Again, I'll turn it over to Minister Blair, but the reality is over the past number of days, federal operations centers and resources have been connecting with provincial authorities who have been preparing for this eventuality. So we already have begun to mobilize resources. So if and when requests come in from other provinces, we will be able to rapidly not just say, yes, we'll do it, but and here it is already. So that's the focus that we've taken. It really happens because there is such a seamless cooperation when it comes to these sorts of events across different orders of government, from the local mayors and emergency responders to the provincial authorities to the federal government with its resources being there. But turning over to Blair for continued follow-up. Sorry, Bill, you need to take off mute.
Sorry, sir. I'd also like to turn this over in a moment to Minister LeBlanc, who's also been in direct contact with those very premiers. I have been speaking to each of my ministerial counterparts in all 5 of the impacted provincial governments. I can tell you that, they're well aware of the availability of our help, and we've been engaged with them in those discussions from over several days. There's been strong indication from a number of the provinces that they fully anticipate that they are going to need our help in the debris removal and the recovery. Most of them are without hydro. There is the initial cleanup and assessment of the damage, and then long term. What we've also heard from our provincial counterparts is they're going to need help in the recovery. There's been significant damage to critical infrastructure, to people's homes and businesses, to communities. The wharves in the Maritimes are such an important critical infrastructure for those communities, and many of them have been absolutely pummeled by Fiona. And so we're going to work with them, not just in the immediate, but over the long term to help rebuild and recover in those communities. We know there's a lot of work to do, but we've been reminded that, winter is coming. There's a lot of damage that has taken place, and there's an urgency to our assistance, and we've assured them. Both Minister LeBlanc and I have been able to assure them that we'll be there for them, and that we'll work with them to assist in that recovery as expeditiously as possible. Canadians deserve nothing less from us. Dominic, I'll go over to you.
Bill, thank you. And Prime Minister Bill said it well when I spoke to the premiers this morning. They are, as you noted, very aware and very grateful for the seamless interaction between federal authorities in their emergency management organizations. That work has been ongoing in recent days. So they spoke to me about the urgency of providing what supplementary resources we may have around helping restore power in terms of removing debris and trees that have fallen on a number of power lines. There's obviously the sort of emergency search and rescue function that Bill noted with the Canadian Coast Guard and the Armed Forces assets. But they very quickly spoke to me about the need for a long-term support around public and critical infrastructure. Bill said it well. Premier King this morning said that roofs have been torn off schools, community centers, fishing harbors are severely damaged. In my part of New Brunswick, as the Prime Minister knows, the lobster season is on right now. So those fishers have a very immediate need to be able to access their livelihood once the storm passes. So this is exactly the kind of work that will accompany provincial authorities in the coming weeks and months, and we'll do it quickly and expeditiously and stay with them until all of this is done.
Thank you to the Prime Minister and the Ministers for the update. Seeing there are no more questions, this puts an end to the press conference. Ceci met fin à la conférence de presse. Merci beaucoup et bonne journée.
Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Merci beaucoup.
Je ne sais pas. Correct.
Moi, j'aimerais vous poser une question.
Ben, allez-y. Ben, non, pas du tout. Pourquoi je me fâcherais après vous?
Ben, je sais pas. J'aimerais savoir, vous êtes ici? Il y a des dégâts aux îles. Qu'est-ce que ça vous fait d'être ici et de voir ça à distance?
Ben écoutez, moi je dois vous dire que j'ai quitté la région depuis le 3 septembre et
I haven't been back to the region since September 3rd, and I know I won't be able to return until next week.
C'est compliqué revenir en région et même ça, je vous disais, j'étais en contact avec le milieu depuis mercredi. Puis je savais très bien au niveau les aéroports allaient se fermer, donc jeudi on fermait les aéroports, donc c'est impossible pour moi là, de revenir dans la région. Mais on est des gens de région. Hein? On est habitué à un moment donné à travailler, à travailler à distance. Ça fait que quand on est dans le milieu, on est très présent dans le milieu, très sur le terrain. Mais d'être à Ottawa aussi, c'est que ça permet d'avoir les contacts avec les ministres, tous les collègues, pour mettre vraiment toutes les ressources en place pour pouvoir aider à supporter le milieu.
Et pour ce qui est de l'avenir,
what do you think about the future of the Magdalen
cette
Islands?
tempête tropicale-là,
This
ça vous
is
dit quoi?
Ben, moi, je peux vous dire que j'étais au niveau des océans, j'étais inquiète quand on a eu l'information cette semaine. Ce qu'on disait aussi, c'est qu'au niveau du haussement on parlait de 2 mètres, puis on l'a vu ce matin, puis moi, ça m'avait été confirmé aussi là, par la direction du CTMA, puis les vieux capitaines de bateaux qui lisent Ils font plus
sea
que connaître la
captains
mer. Là.
because
Ils
they
lisent
know
la
much more than
mer
the sea. They can read the ocean, and they can read the
skies. Le Madeleine 2 parce que la
And so
crainte
they
qu'on
said, we're
avait,
going to have
c'était
to move the Magdalene 2
éventuellement le
because
bateau, vu qu'on allait être à hauteur de quai, on voulait pas que les bateaux se ramassent sur le quai. Donc, ce qu'on disait mercredi, c'est qu'on allait transférer le Madeleine 2 à Souris parce que les infrastructures sont meilleures. Puis, ce que ça me dit, c'est qu'au niveau des réchauffements climatiques, au niveau des océans, on doit vraiment avoir des infrastructures qui soient beaucoup plus résilientes. Et c'est pour ça aussi que vendredi après-midi, je parlais avec le bureau du ministre Blair pour dire est-ce qu'éventuellement il pourrait, est-ce qu'il y a un plan d'évacuation qui pourrait être mis en place parce que quand on regarde les îles de Madeleine, c'est 97 kilomètres de plage,
97 kilometers of beaches.
En termes de longueur là, en plein milieu
That's
du
how long the
golfe.
beaches, and it's
Donc,
right smack
on
in the
parlait
middle
de
of the Gulf of St.
vagues
Lawrence.
de 15 mètres. Ce matin, on parlait de
waves were
17
15
mètres.
meters
Puis, à des
high,
endroits, ça va,
in some
ça va
places,
passer là, d'un côté à l'autre. Ça fait que
it's
c'est
going to
sûr qu'on
simply,
est inquiet. On est inquiet pour les populations.
swamp
Puis il y a
the
des
whole
discussions
island. So we're
importantes
worried
aussi
for the
qui doivent se
residents,
faire
and
au
so we
niveau
have to
des,
have
justement, au
important
niveau du réchauffement
discussions
des océans.
about
Puis avec
ocean
les gens
warming,
des îles de la
climate
Madeleine.
change. So we need to discuss that with the
Merci.
people from the Maggies. Thank you.